Well, I'm not sure having a hat with press in the brim makes you a reporter, Steve. Haven't you heard about digital? Things have changed. You know, it's always a pleasure to introduce a fellow Rotarian, and in this case, a privilege to introduce a fellow journalist. Stephanie Riegel has excelled in many forms of media, print, broadcast, and that elusive digital, whatever that is. She was born in New Orleans, and she was a journalism graduate from LSU. She began her career in print at Gambit and City Business after finishing graduate school in history at Tulane University. I first encountered Stephanie when she was working for WWL television and when they evacuated during Hurricane Katrina, and they were broadcasting from LPB studios. And I was so impressed with all that she did during that time. And we're fortunate that she moved and is now a Baton Rouge native. She did some sort of freelance work for a while, including some work, frankly, with us that we were thrilled about. She, in 2010, took over as food editor at the Baton Rouge Advocate, building on the food column she co-authored with her sister for 7 years. Since 2012, she's been editor of the Greater Baton Rouge Business Report, where she covers a variety of issues across both print and digital. She's married with 3 children, 20-year-old twin daughters who are at Tulane, and a son who's at Catholic High. Let's welcome Stephanie Riegel.
I'm going to lower the microphones because I'm shorter than everybody. But I'm happy to be here, and I have to tell you, I'm a little bit intimidated to be here among my own people. And so I'm fine when I go to the West Side or to Ascension and give a speech, but I know y'all well, and half the time I'm calling people in this room to find out what's going on so I can fill up the daily report. So I'm not sure how much I can tell you, but you know, it reminded me of one of the first times I ever gave a speech when I was a reporter at WWL in the early 90s. And it was not for a Rotary Club, but it was for, I think, a Kiwanis Club. And I don't know what in the world they thought I could tell them when I was 26 or so, but I went over there with my big shoulder pads and my super big hair and white pantyhose and talked to them about whatever I said. And one of them raised their hand and said, "Does Mike Hoss dye his hair?" He's the sports guy. It's like, yeah, good question, okay. And then another one said, "Do you know Susan Rosegen, who was the competing anchor on Channel 6? And I said, "Yeah, I do." "Well, now she's pretty." And I said, "Well, she is." So I hope y'all will be a little nicer on me. Daryl told me that he wanted me to talk about some of the realities of life here, because he said we get too many rah-rah speeches at lunch, but that I had to stay on the rails. And I don't know if I really know that middle ground. So, but I'm not probably as negative and cynical on Baton Rouge as people think that I am. My biography was wrong. I was actually born here, and I lived here until I was 3. In the married student apartments with my parents on West Roosevelt. So to an extent, like, Baton Rouge is kind of part of my DNA. You know, I mean, like that sound of the birds early in the morning when you look up at the sky. I mean, those are my earliest memories of Baton Rouge. And I used to go watch the Tiger Band march every afternoon in that little field out there. And then when I went to LSU for 4 years, and even though I was in the LSU bubble, certainly that's part of my formative experience. And when I was on TV, I came up here all the time to cover the legislature and the trials of Governor Edwin Edwards. I mean, it was great news, I have to tell you. The gambling commission stuff, the riverboat casino hearings. I mean, so I know Baton Rouge from that perspective. And then I chose to stay here and convinced my sweet husband, Greg Wolverton there, for those of y'all who don't know, to stay with us after Katrina, because I wanted to raise our kids here and get away from New Orleans for a while, because I didn't think it was the best place to be. And so I have a real appreciation for Baton Rouge, And I loved being here as a young mom with little kids because I was free of the ball and chain of living in the place where I had grown up, and I could just explore everything Baton Rouge has to offer. And it does have so much to offer. And I would take my kids to the farmer's market, and we'd do field trips, and I went to museums, and everybody else was like doing soccer games and birthday parties, and I was really experiencing everything this community had to offer for the first time because I didn't have anything else to do. I was homeschooling my kids after a hurricane, you know? And so I really do have, in many ways, a positive appreciation for the city. But working as a journalist for the Business Report and being a hard news reporter, I also do see some of the downsides and some of the pitfalls. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. And I think just sort of as a precursor, people always say, you know, what's wrong with Baton Rouge? What are some of our biggest problems? You know, we're always butting our head up against a wall trying to figure out. And I think, you know, the fact that you've heard this before, but it still really is a big, small town that hasn't figured out what it wants to be when it grows up. And do we really want to do what it takes to become bigger and better and more diversified? I love this city, but it is very provincial, and everybody knows each other, and people are afraid to speak out. They're afraid of offending someone. They're afraid of getting on the bad list of, you know, the city club or the country club or, God forbid, the Baton Rouge Area Foundation. And that affects so much, and God bless you if you're out there, hey, but I mean, it's just the truth. People here are afraid, and I think that really affects our ability to move forward in some ways. Now, the reality of living here is this. Much of the hardship that we deal with in Baton Rouge is just because we're in Louisiana. And so the problems that we face here in Baton Rouge are the problems that we face in Louisiana. Y'all know what these are. Okay? We have the highest poverty rate, one of the highest poverty rates in the country. You've heard this, but just think about that for a minute, okay? Third highest poverty rate in the nation at 19.9%, and our deep poverty rate is 8.8%. That's tremendous. Thank God for New Mexico and Mississippi. They keep us off the bottom, and how a state with so many abundant resources has managed to squander them over the decades is a very worthy discussion for another talk. But the reality is we gave away the farm to enrich a few people, and we settled on chicken feed. We have a charming state. Yeah, there you go. There's Louisiana, Mississippi, and New Mexico. So we have a charming state, but we have a problem with 80% of our residents are from here. And that makes our culture rich. That's why we have wonderful crawfish boils with the grandparents and multiple generations. But only 20% of the people who live here are outsiders. And I know y'all have heard that statistic as well, but think about that, you know, and how that really hinders our economic development, new development, fresh ideas. And it's especially problematic given the fact that we are losing more people. And Arizona, for instance, is the exact opposite. They're 20% native born and 80% outsiders. Okay, so over like roughly the past 20 years, we've had a negative net migration of more than 296,000 people. That means that many more people left than came in. And during that same period, Texas had a net in-migration of 1 million people. This is a problem. And one of the other issues that we deal with here, of course, is our tax structure. We recently, in the Business Report, looked just at how bad our tax structure is, because we hear people complain about it a lot, and we wanted to know, you know, what's really the situation with the state tax burden, and if you lived in Baton Rouge versus the Woodlands, Texas, how would you come out? Interestingly, we found that like Louisiana and Texas are roughly the same at 7.6%. And if you lived in the Woodlands versus here in East Baton Rouge, you know, upper middle class family there, your taxable income would be roughly the same. And that was kind of surprising. Okay, fine. But when you factor in the private school tuition that many, many people in East Baton Rouge Parish pay, you see that we come out way behind by about $17,000. And this is one of the real anti-competitive factors that drives or keeps business and industry away from Louisiana. And more importantly is the way that Texas spends its money. We looked at, you know, how their governments are set up, and they're more decentralized. Local governments have more governing authority, more government control, local control, and that gives greater efficiencies, more accountabilities, and that equals more effective government. And sometimes people say, well, I mean, do you really want East Baton Rouge Parish government to have more control than the state? Well, that's the way it's supposed to work. And one of the problems in Louisiana over the years is that you have to go to the state capitol to kiss the ring to get what you want. We've heard a lot, and again, this is not just a Baton Rouge thing, it's a Louisiana thing, but about how our tax structure is so completely anti-competitive. And it's unpredictable, and it changes from year to year. And this is one reason why companies don't want to come here. And this is all going to come to a head this year. As you all are very much aware, we keep talking about this fiscal cliff that the state is going to fall off. Jay Darden was here back in August, and he talked about it, and how systemic change is the only real way to address this problem. This happens year after year. The business community has acknowledged this. We've had 3 separate task forces that have looked at what we have to do to restructure the tax system, and yet for some reason, nobody wants to do it. For the past 2 years, there was thought that this was going to come up in the legislature. It hadn't happened. And you mentioned the word tax, and everybody just wants to vote no. And it's getting worse. I mean, there's less and less faith among the general populace in government, and people are inclined to vote against anything and any new tax that the government proposes. And this affects our infrastructure, and it affects our economic development, and it affects our competitiveness. And so this is really what I want to talk about is economic development, because we're losing battles here every day. Whoops, and we don't even know it, and we don't even realize it. Now, we do have some wins occasionally, and in fact, there was a major win earlier this week. The governor announced DXC Technology coming to New Orleans. I'm sure y'all read about it. $25 billion company that was a partial spinoff of HP, 2,000, quote, well-paying jobs that they're going to create in New Orleans over the next decade, and the economic impact figures are very impressive, hundreds of millions of dollars over the years that'll supposedly more than make up for the $100 million incentive package that the state is coming up with. And this is all very good, but it's very important to realize, and I was just telling Beth this as we were talking about it, that the real reason this company chose Louisiana is because we are a cheap place to do business. And that's something great that we can use as a marketing tool, of course, but it's important to realize that they're not coming here because we have the best and brightest workforce. They're coming here because we are cheap. And in fact, when this company was formed just in April, the CEO said in some public filings, because they're a publicly traded company, that they were going to trim the cost of operations by $100 million this year. And they were going to look to open one new low-cost facility. Well, here we are, a low-cost facility. So we hear about these good jobs, and certainly they're good jobs compared to maybe working as a busboy in a hotel or something in downtown New Orleans, but they're still not super high-end jobs, and I think we need to remember that and keep an eye on how these deals develop over the years, because oftentimes they don't live up to the reality. A lot of times they don't really live up to the hype. What we don't hear about so much are the deals that we don't get and why we don't get them. And unfortunately, when you talk to economic development people around and site selectors and consultants, they tell you that there are many lists that we just don't even make. And so what are some of the reasons for this? Hello, don't need to tell y'all about traffic. Infrastructure is a major one. And as you all are aware, we have a $15 billion backlog around the state of projects that we need to get to. And that's not including the mega projects that we need just to make the capital region function properly, like a new bridge across the river or a bump. And y'all remember Steve Carter was here earlier this year. He tried to pass a gasoline tax in the legislature. What better time could there have been to pass a gasoline tax than when gas was at $2 a gallon? But unfortunately, it didn't even get that far. Steve had to pull that legislation because the idea was so unpopular, and he didn't want to force his colleagues to make an unpopular vote on the House floor. We heard speeches about it earlier in this club and around the community, but we're not going to be able to bring this issue up again at the legislative level for like 3 or 4 more years. 2018 is a non-fiscal session, so they can't take up a tax. 2019 is an election year, so they're not going to want to take up a tax. And 2020 is another non-fiscal session, so they're not going to want to they can't take up a tax. So that'll be 2021 before the legislature could even possibly take up this issue again. What are we going to do in the meantime? I mean, I keep hearing talk around that there are some private sector initiatives underway, that there's talk about maybe getting some sort of tax exemptions to pay for this, P3 partnerships, but I don't know. I mean, how do you come up with the money for a new bridge across the river? And how long will it take to make that happen even once funding is in place? There are no short-term solutions for this anytime soon. I mean, a lot of us will be retired, if not dead, by the time we get the traffic situation under control in this town, and that works against us every day. Another thing that works against us is our airport, and this is really sort of controversial, and the airport's been in the news a lot lately because our fellow Rotarian, Councilwoman Barbara Freiberg, has been pushing for a national search for a new airport director. It's not the airport facility. I mean, the airport here is wonderful. They have upgraded it. It is clean. It has great Wi-Fi. They've got good lights in the parking lot. There just aren't that many people there because there aren't any flights. So, I mean, it's great to fly out of, but they just don't have flights. And that's what most people look to an airport for, commercial air service. But you laugh, but I was talking to the chairman of the airport commission about this about a year ago, and he said, Steph, you don't know, we have so much more going on with the airport. We've got, private aviation, and we've got, charter flights, and we have an economic development park with a car dealership and a Coca-Cola bottling plant. I'm like, right, but what about commercial air service? He said the airport's about so much more than commercial air service. Now, maybe it is, but I mean, my thought would be if we're really just going to give the Baton Rouge airport over to people with private planes and charter service, then maybe let's really work on that Spain train so that we can have easy, quick transport to the New Orleans airport. Or maybe let's figure out some other way to get to the New Orleans airport and focus our energies there. But if we can't do anything to get more direct flights to the airport here, which is what we need, and then that increases utilization, and then utilization brings in more direct flights, right? It's one of those kind of positive snowball effects. Then we need to look to the New Orleans airport so that when companies come here to look at us as a potential site for their new facility, we can say, hey, we don't have an airport, but we've got quick transport to the airport in New Orleans. Of course, education, whoops, I'm missing my little schoolhouse picture. Education is holding us back. That's another huge one. And y'all may remember when Albemarle was considering leaving here, which they eventually did, the state put together an incredible incentive package that would have created a charter school for Albemarle that would have assigned reserved a certain number of seats for kids of their employees. That just goes to show you the lengths to which we have to go in economic development circles to try to be competitive. Now, as it turns out, I think the company had other reasons for wanting to leave, and they went to North Carolina. But the schools are a huge thing. I think Warren Drake is as wonderful a superintendent as we could have. I think he's got great ideas. I really don't follow the school board, so I can't tell you much about them. But we're not making enough progress. Whoops. Are we there? Not making enough progress in terms of our performance. And the metrics show that time and again. And then a bigger thing, and this sort of gets back to more of the culture of Baton Rouge that I was alluding to a few minutes ago. And it's the quality of life. And when you talk to site selection consultants, they refer to the things like the bike paths and pedestrian-friendly communities and, farmers market and the things that no one is willing to fund. I don't have to remind you that our Metro Council would not even let us vote on Mayor Broom's I forgot what she called it, Better Streets plan, but it was basically the same plan that Kip Holden had put forward last year as Greenlight 2, but it had all sorts of wonderful, now, this is my editorial comment, calling them wonderful quality of life projects in there, like bike paths and parks and things that would really help. If that is your vision for Baton Rouge, but I don't need to tell y'all, I mean, when you write about these things in the business report and you read the comments, you see how negative people are about those kind of things. And they say, how dare we spend tax dollars, throw away tax dollars on downtown and mid-city and bike lane. I mean, people don't get the direct connection between economic development, between attracting creative class professionals to this market, which we need because a rising tide lifts all ships, and between those types of amenities, I mean, if we want to live in a 21st century competitive community, that's what we need to do. We're doing fine if you like the way things were in the 1970s, but that's not the way things work anymore. Another issue that I think facing Baton Rouge specifically is the St. George Incorporation effort, and you haven't heard much about it since it died the first time a couple of years ago, but it is coming back from what I understand. I'm not involved in it, but from what I've heard and talked to people who are involved in it, they intend to bring it back early next year, probably in February. The footprint will be smaller this time around, but I think that they are going to have a lot more support than they did the first time around, unfortunately, because of some of the early missteps in Mayor Broom's administration, which I think she has really begun to address and correct. But there were issues, the goofy chief administrative officer thing with the guy who had lied on his resume and had not been vetted, and then the Brave contracts, and that turned into a public relations disaster. And even her unwillingness to sort of jump into the fray on the Council on Aging disputes and sort of let people know that this isn't the way we do things in Baton Rouge. But she didn't. And I think Mayor Broom is a really good woman, and she is really working extremely hard. But those early missteps counted against her, and there were a lot of people who even maybe voted for her, who were dead set against St. George the first time around, who this time I think are going to be more forgiving, I mean, they've just kind of thrown up their hands. People are so kind of fed up with everything. I think you're going to have people who are more willing to maybe not support it, but at least not fight it as hard. I do think Mayor Broom is really getting her act together. And like I said, there were early missteps. I don't think she was getting advice necessarily from the best people. And her experience was such that she was coming from the Senate, and it's a totally different ballgame over there. I mean, they just don't have to do as much. I mean, she didn't have administrative experience. I think her hiring of Darrell Gissel as Chief Administrative Officer has been a tremendous boon and definitely one of the smartest things that she could have done. Darrell is a really good guy, and he has a lot of community building smarts and a lot more political experience than people realized. And she can trust him, and I think he's leading her down a good path. And even just in the past month since he's been on board, I think you've seen things improve. So I think that we're getting on the right track with the city administration. Certainly, I'm going to hold off for a few months being critical until I've made sure. But I think that we can feel good about this. So where are we headed in Baton Rouge? I mean, that's one thing that I think we're not quite sure of at this point. Mayor Kip Holden really embraced a new urbanist vision for this city. I think that chart was sort of set with the plans of Plan Baton Rouge going back to the early 2000s, and that really have been executed behind the scenes largely by the Baton Rouge Area Foundation over the years. And the Holden administration bought into that. For better or worse, and I think mostly for better. Some might disagree. I don't know that the new administration is quite on board with that program. I mean, from what I understand, I think the foundation is working furiously to try to get her on their same page. But I think there are still some good things happening here, of course, but we face a lot of challenges. And So when I go out around the community and particularly like to the mid-city area, I see a lot of hope. I see a lot of young people. But I do think this community is afraid. We used to take canvas trips to Austin and different communities like that, keep Austin weird and what can we do to be like them? We don't really want to be like them, and we really don't want to be weird. And so I think Baton Rouge really needs to ask itself what it wants to be and where it wants to be, and then take the steps to get there. So I saved time for questions because I know a lot of people usually run out of time. But I found when I talk to groups, usually some of the most interesting discussion comes from the questions. So if you don't ask me if I know other pretty news people on TV, I'd be happy to answer some questions. Anybody?
Does Henry Winkler die?
I've never met Henry Winkler.
So what do you think is going to happen vis-a-vis the cliff, the fiscal cliff? Are they just going to push that sales tax, forward?
I just don't see. I think they're going to keep pushing the sales tax forward, which again is going to directly affect our economic competitiveness. I mean, I think. I don't see any consensus or willingness to come together. I mean, we see it at the federal level. We certainly see it at the state level. There's so much division and partisan politics. I mean, even when you look at all the good that Governor Edwards has accomplished, and there are factions here that just because he has a D after his name, they don't want to deal with him. They don't want to play ball. They attack what he does with lies and misstatements that aren't even true and that misrepresent to a gullible public what's really going on. I mean, y'all heard Jay Darden here speak, right? I mean, Jay is a fiscal conservative. He's been a Republican forever. Jay would not be working with this governor and saying what he's saying if it wasn't true. I mean, you can just believe him. It's a fact. And yet there are groups like Lobby going around saying how much we've increased the size of the state budget and how much spending has increased under Governor Edwards. I mean, it's just not true. I don't know how you get that message out. And I know just from experience what we write about in the business report, if it's about taxes and it's really in-depth and it really explains stuff in detail, people don't read it. I can promise you they just don't. And like after the gasoline tax didn't even come up for a vote in the legislature this year. I was arguing with some gentleman in the gym. He's a small business owner, anti-tax this, anti-tax that. And when I started talking to him about it, he said, well, why didn't anybody tell me this? And I said, well, it was really all over the newspapers. You just had to read about it. He said, well, I didn't know. I mean, people just don't know. People aren't as well informed as they used to be. And when it gets to budget and taxes, it's difficult and complicated. But that's all of which is a long answer to say that I just don't see the legislature coming together and taking the hard steps and even doing something, that would give the other side across the aisle credit, perhaps, for a win. So I think as long as they can just keep renewing temporary sales taxes and kicking the can down the road, it'll keep us kind of mired in the same sort of economic situation that we're in now. Yes.
Thank you, Stephanie. We hear a lot from other reporters that they decide on the agenda of the news of the day based on the number of clicks that they receive to the website, the number of comments. Not all reporters, but there are many who have told me that. Are you driven in your editorial decisions by the same or similar types of activity?
Well, I mean, I personally am not, but it is hard not to look at the metrics and factor that in. I mean, to an extent, back in the TV days, we look at overnight ratings, and I mean, let's face it, people watch more stories about murder and crime than they would when I'd come up here to the legislature and do a story on the budget. The thing with the clicks that's difficult is you get those metrics, constantly, and you see what people respond to. To the extent, for instance, that we play up restaurant news really big in the daily report, I would have to say yes, and I'm embarrassed, but it is true. When we write about a restaurant in Baton Rouge, people go crazy. So it's interesting, and it's not like it's bad. I mean, it's not like it has a political agenda, but if we can write about a new Mexican chain coming to town, people get really psyched up about that, and then somebody will share it on Facebook, and we'll get way more clicks than for something like I'll break a really good story that has such statewide implications, and like 2,000 people read it. And I'll think, well, maybe they're the 2,000 people who matter, but I don't know.